Guys, I almost fell into the trap. I was going to make a video with a tier list predicting the M+ healer meta in patch 10.2. I was this close, but then I remembered something. We already know the healer meta for next season and pretty much every season. What am I talking about? Let me explain. But before I do, I want to preface this by saying I'm a big proponent of playing whatever the heck you want. Every season, literally every healer is capable of timing keys that less than 1% of the player base even attempts anyway, so there's really not much reason to force yourself into playing something that you don't enjoy. I mean, I think it's personally a lot cooler to be pushing keys as one of the few people that plays a particular spec than just another guy pushing with the meta spec, but I do understand that it can be frustrating to get declined from groups just because of the spec you play. Anyway, I digress. How do we basically always know what healing specs are going to be good in Mythic Plus? A while back, Reddit user Alcaris made this sweet spreadsheet that mapped out how meta every spec in the game was over the course of every Mythic Plus season, and then came up with an average for each spec. All credit to him, but since his version ended at the end of Shadowlands Season 3, I just updated it with 3 more columns for Shadowlands Season 4 and Dragonflight Season 1 and 2, since in my opinion the Dragonflight Season 2 meta is pretty much already in the books. So basically the number we see for each spec under each season represents their place in the healing meta season, meaning 1 is really good and higher numbers are bad. All this is based off of sub-creation data, which, while far from perfect, is probably the best and admittedly easiest thing to go off of. I'm not trying to be all doom and gloom or balance wine in this video, I just felt like avoiding falling into the same thing we do every season where we dig through all the patch notes and see that this heal got buffed or that spell got nerfed and then try to piece it all together into a tier list to figure out what's going to be good or bad in the next season. Don't worry, I promise we'll do that anyway when the season gets a little closer and the PTR builds settle in a little bit. I think they've still got quite a bit of tuning left to do. So looking at this data, the obvious thing that jumps out to you is that Holy Paladin Resto Druid have the most likely chance of being meta in any given season. They're almost always in the top 3, one or the other is often number 1, and they have a very high floor. There are only a couple seasons where they were in the bottom half of the healing pool. In fact, in the case of Holy Paladin, there are only 2 seasons where Holy Paladin wasn't in the top 2 healers in Mythic Plus. Then you got Shaman in the kind of best of the rest role, while both pre-specs running fairly even with each other, Mistweaver and Preservation, which I don't really count yet, and I'll get into that in a second. In fact, the only seasons where the number 1 healer wasn't a Holy Paladin or Resto Druid was Shadowlands Season 3 and 4, where Holy Priest took over. And sadly, that was because of Fey Guardians, a spell that doesn't exist anymore. In the case of Evoker, I think we'll actually see them be on the higher end of the spectrum. After we get a few seasons under their belts, they gave the class a decent amount of utility, their damage couldn't really be any easier to get out, and they really had a great Dragonflight Season 1, it's just in Season 2, Preservation kind of got strangled out by the fact that an Aug Evoker was seemingly required in every single Mythic Plus group. They have the makeup of a really strong Mythic healing spec, so we're just going to kind of leave them out of this conversation for now. So long story short, we want to pick a healer and always have a pretty good chance of being decent in Mythic Plus and getting groups. Choice is easily Holy Paladin or Resto Druid. So what do these specs have that the others don't? This discussion came up a lot pre-Dragonflight, where people complain that healers don't heal enough and are basically there just to do damage. People wanted their healing to be the most impactful part of what determines whether or not you're a good healer. Makes sense, right? So at the beginning of Dragonflight Season 1, Blizzard made some really extreme healing checks in dungeons, but they weren't really able to balance around them, and at first, only Resto Druid and Preservation Evoker could reliably meet these healing checks. So dungeons got nerfed pretty hard, and we got closer to what we had before in Shadowlands. So basically, to make every healing spec at least viable, Blizzard needs to balance things so that every healing spec can meet the healing needs of dungeons. Sure, some will have an easier time than others, and the spec's healing style may or may not mesh well with the healing profile of the dungeons and the encounters, but in general, all the healers can heal all the dungeons, up to a really extreme key level. If all the healers can heal stuff, then it's what they bring to the table outside of their healing that will determine what is quote-unquote good, and that's where Resto Druid and Holy Paladin have been kicking everyone's ass for the last 5 years or so. So if we're judging all the healers against each other, and healing is essentially cancelled out because all the healers can effectively heal the dungeons, That leaves us with damage, survivability, and utility. And for whatever reason, when Blizzard was handing out utility, they gave Druid and Paladin a ton of it. Shaman definitely got its share, and Monk and Priest clearly didn't get the memo. We've learned this lesson over and over again, season after season. Of course, there's other things to consider here as well, like what DPS and tank specs are going to be brought to a group. There isn't really a better example of this than the current Holy Paladin in Dragonflight Season 2. Nobody expected HPal to be the meta at the start of Season 2, but the power of immunity, bleed removals, and the necessity for a low cooldown kick when running a triple range DPS meta all of a sudden made Paladin fit like a glove. Damage also plays a big role here too, particularly passive damage. I mean, I was shocked at how much DPS a Holy Priest could put out until I realized how many GCDs I actually needed to use to make it happen. Nope, we want damage that we don't really need to do much to get out, something that Paladin and Druid have historically had a pretty easy time in doing. Remember how we talked about those 2 seasons where Holy Priest reigned supreme because of Fey Guardians? What did Fey Guardians give Priest? Yep, utility, as well as damage for other members of the group. Given the recent changes coming to Mythic Plus in Season 3, I'm not convinced Blizzard really cares too much about balance in Mythic Plus. They seem way more concerned with raid, and whether or not that's the right move is the topic for another video, so let me write that down real quick. But if we want to see something other than Druid or Paladin at the top of the heap, then specs like Mistweaver, Holy, and Disc need to be brought up to the level of Paladin and Druid in terms of the utility they bring to a group. Until that happens, I don't really see either spec taking the lead in an M+ season unless it's somehow allowed to just remain ludicrously overtuned, and again, based on the numbers, that doesn't really seem likely to happen. I say all this because I know I've seen people on YouTube, including myself, reading recent patch notes and seeing different heals get buffed or mana changes and thinking that it might finally be time for this spec or that spec to rise to the top. Historically speaking, that seems unlikely. I mean, I'm leaning heavily toward maining Disc Priest next season because I'm excited for the gameplay changes, but knowing that Power Infusion and Mass Dispel have both been nerfed, I don't really have any delusions that either Priest spec is going to be King Healer in Dragonflight Season 3. But it looks fun, the tier set looks cool, so that's good enough for me. So what do you guys think? Is this just an oversimplification of how the healing meta forms in Mythic Plus, or do you guys think that Blizzard needs to take more into account when they try and balance the specs such as utility and damage rather than just amounts of healing that our heals do? I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments. As always, if you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to see more of my content in the future. Also, you can check out my stream right here on YouTube, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday nights, 9 p.m. Pacific, where we do a ton of healing, have lots of fun with a great community. Hope to see you guys there sometime. And until the next one, happy healing.